The ESPN studio felt unusually quiet that Tuesday evening in Los Angeles. The familiar hum of cameras and production equipment created a subtle backdrop as Shaquille O'Neal settled into the leather chair across from the interviewer. At 51, the basketball legend still commanded attention with his imposing 7'1" frame, but tonight something was different. His usual boisterous energy seemed subdued, replaced by a contemplative heaviness that hung in the air like morning fog over the Pacific. The interviewer, Sarah Chen, had been covering sports for over 15 years, but she could sense this wasn't going to be a typical post-game analysis or lighthearted banter about his TNT show. When Shaq's publicist had reached out about doing a deep-dive interview on his relationship with Kobe Bryant, she knew this would be something special and potentially difficult. "Shaq, thank you for being here tonight," Sarah began, her voice gentle but professional. "I know this isn't easy to talk about." Shaquille shifted in his chair, his massive hands clasped together. The studio lights caught the gold chain around his neck, a simple cross that he'd worn for years. Outside, the Los Angeles traffic hummed along Sunset Boulevard, the city that had been home to both him and Kobe for so many transformative years. "You know, Sarah," Shaq began, his voice already carrying a weight that wasn't usually there, "people always ask me about the championships, about the dominance, about those Lakers teams, and yeah, we were incredible. But what they don't understand is—" He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "What they don't understand is how complicated it all was." The camera operator adjusted his angle slightly, sensing the gravity of the moment. This wasn't going to be about statistics or highlight reels. "When I think about Kobe now," Shaq continued, "especially after everything that happened in January 2020, I don't think about the arguments first. I think about this kid. And he was just a kid when we first met, who had this fire in him that I'd never seen before. He came straight from high school, speaking multiple languages, carrying himself like he'd been in the league for 10 years. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "What was that first impression like? You were already established, and here comes this teenager." Shaq's expression softened, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Man, he was cocky. But it wasn't arrogance for the sake of it. It was confidence born from this unshakable belief that he belonged there. "I remember our first practice together in '96. He's guarding me, and I'm thinking, okay, Rook, let me show you how this works." I back him down, expecting him to give way like most young players do. "But Kobe?" He pushed back. Hard. The memory seemed to transport Shaq back to those early days at the Lakers' practice facility in El Segundo. The squeaking of sneakers on hardwood, the echo of bouncing basketballs, the stern voice of Coach Del Harris trying to manage two massive personalities. "That's when I knew," Shaq said, his voice growing quieter. "That's when I knew this wasn't going to be like any other teammate situation. This kid was going to challenge me, whether I wanted it or not." Sarah noticed the way Shaq's hands had unconsciously formed fists as he spoke, not from anger, but from the intensity of the memory. "And how did that make you feel, having someone challenge you so directly? For the first time in, the interview?" Shaq hesitated. His eyes shifted to the studio window, where the lights of Los Angeles stretched out endlessly. Somewhere out there, in a cemetery in Newport Beach, Kobe Bryant lay at rest, and the weight of that reality seemed to press down on the big man's shoulders. "At first, I was irritated," Shaq admitted. "I was the established star. I'd already proven myself in Orlando, even though we didn't win it all there. I came to LA to win championships, and here's this teenager, acting like he knows better than me about everything." The honesty in his voice was striking. This wasn't the media-trained Shaq that fans usually saw on television. This was a man grappling with complex emotions and the burden of hindsight. "But then we started winning," he continued, "and winning changes everything. When you're winning, you start to think maybe the friction is worth it. Maybe having someone push you, even when it's uncomfortable, makes you better." Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out on Shaq's face. The studio felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as if the cameras had disappeared, and this was just two people having a conversation about loss and regret. "The thing is," Shaq said, his voice beginning to crack slightly. I never told him that. I never told him how much I respected that fire, how much it pushed me to be better. We were so busy competing with each other that we forgot we were on the same team. The first hint of tears appeared in Shaq's eyes, barely visible, but unmistakably there. This was the moment Sarah had sensed was coming, the emotional core of why they were here tonight. And now, Shaq's voice trailed off as he looked down at his hands. Now I can't tell him. The silence in the studio stretched for several seconds, filled only by the distant hum of Los Angeles traffic and the soft whir of camera equipment. Sarah waited, understanding that sometimes the most powerful moments in an interview come in the spaces between words. When Shaq looked up again, his eyes were bright with unshed tears, and the usually jovial giant looked more vulnerable than perhaps anyone had ever seen him in public. That's my biggest regret, Sarah. Not that we argued, not that we had our differences. My biggest regret is that I never fully fixed things with him. We were getting there, you know? We were getting better, but I thought we had time. The weight of Shaq's admission hung in the studio air as Sarah prepared for the next phase of their conversation. She had covered enough emotional interviews to know when to push forward and when to let silence do the work. Right now, she could see that Shaq needed to tell this story, not just for the cameras, but for himself. Let's talk about those championship years, Sarah said softly. From the outside, it looked like the perfect partnership. 3 straight titles, dominant performances, 2 superstars at the height of their powers. Shaq wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Oh, gesture that seemed almost childlike coming from someone his size. The studio lights caught the moisture on his cheeks, making his vulnerability even more apparent. Perfect partnership, he repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. That's what everyone saw. And in some ways, it was true. On the court, we were unstoppable. I'd dominate inside, create space, and Kobe would do things that made me shake my head in amazement. The kid could score from anywhere, at any time. He paused, collecting himself before continuing. But perfect? Man, we were a mess. A beautiful, championship-winning mess. Sarah leaned back slightly, giving him space to elaborate. Outside, a police siren wailed in the distance, a reminder of the city that never slept around them. The 2000 finals against Indiana, Shaq began, his voice steadier now as he fell into the rhythm of storytelling. Game 4. I foul out with 5 minutes left, and we're down by 8. I'm sitting on the bench thinking, this is it. We're going to blow this. And then Kobe just took over. Scored 28 points in that game, but those last 5 minutes? That was pure magic. The memories seemed to energize him, bringing back some of his natural charisma. I remember sitting there watching him thinking, this is why we can win it all. Not because he was trying to show me up, not because he was trying to be the star. He was trying to win. And in that moment I loved him for it. But that love was complicated, Sarah observed. Everything with Kobe was complicated, Shaq replied immediately. He was the hardest worker I'd ever seen, but he wouldn't let anyone else work differently than him. He was incredibly smart about the game, but he thought everyone else was stupid if they didn't see it his way. He was loyal to winning, but he questioned everything and everyone. Shaq's phone buzzed on the small table beside him, but he ignored it completely. This conversation had his full attention. I remember one practice in 2001, he continued. Phil Jackson is trying to run a play, and Kobe stops everything. Just stops the whole practice to argue about a screen angle. Not because he was being difficult, but because he genuinely believed that if we didn't get every detail right, we'd lose. I'm standing there thinking, dude, it's practice. We're the best team in the league. But for him, that was exactly why it mattered. Sarah could hear the admiration in Shaq's voice, even as he described moments of frustration. It sounds like you understood each other better than people realized. We did and we didn't, Shaq said, shaking his head. The problem was we were both used to being the guy. In Orlando, everything ran through me. For Kobe, even in high school, he was the star. Then you put us together, and we're both alphas trying to lead the same pack. The emotional weight was building again, and Sarah could see Shaq struggling with memories that were both triumphant and painful. The worst part was the media, he continued, his voice hardening slightly. They loved the drama. Every little disagreement became a headline. Shaq and Kobe feud. Lakers dynasty in trouble. They turned our competitive nature into some kind of soap opera. How did that affect your relationship with him personally? Shaq was quiet for a long moment, his large frame seeming to shrink slightly in the chair. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. It made us defensive. Instead of talking to each other about problems, we'd read about our problems in the newspaper. Instead of settling things privately, we'd make passive-aggressive comments in interviews. The media circus made everything worse because we stopped communicating directly. A tear finally escaped, rolling down Shaq's cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away this time. I said things about Kobe in interviews that I shouldn't have said. He said things about me. We were both trying to protect our own legacies, but we were damaging something bigger than either of us. We were damaging a friendship that could have been legendary. Sarah felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about basketball anymore. This was about two men who had achieved incredible success together, but had lost something precious in the process. The 2004 season, Shaq continued, his voice thick with emotion, everything fell apart. We were supposed to win it all again. We had Gary Payton, Karl Malone, the whole dream team set up. But Kobe and I were barely speaking. We'd run plays together, we'd win games, but we weren't connected anymore. He paused, looking directly into the camera for the first time in several minutes. When Detroit beat us in the finals, I wasn't just sad about losing the championship. I was sad because I knew it was over. I knew one of us was leaving, and I knew we'd failed at something bigger than basketball. We'd failed at being brothers. The studio fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't just a pause in conversation. It was the weight of regret settling over everything. That summer, when I got traded to Miami, Shaq said, his voice cracking again, Kobe and I barely said goodbye. Can you imagine that? 5 years together, 3 championships, and we couldn't even say goodbye properly. The emotional intensity of the previous revelations seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Sarah could see that Shaq was wrestling with memories that were both precious and painful, and she knew they were approaching the heart of his regret. The studio lights seemed softer now, creating an almost intimate atmosphere despite the cameras rolling. After Miami, after you left the Lakers, Sarah began carefully, how long was it before you and Kobe spoke again? Shaq let out a long breath, his massive shoulders rising and falling like a mountain settling. Too long. Way too long. He rubbed his face with both hands before continuing. It was probably 2 years before we had a real conversation. 2 years of seeing each other at all-star games, at league events, and just nodding, like acquaintances. The pain in his voice was evident. This wasn't the gregarious Shaq that fans knew from television, cracking jokes and keeping things light. This was a man confronting one of his deepest regrets. What finally broke the ice? Funny thing, Shaq said, a small sad smile crossing his face. It was his kids. I saw him at a charity event in 2006, somewhere in Beverly Hills, and his daughters were there. Beautiful little girls, and they were wearing Lakers jerseys, with my old number 34 on them. Sarah could see the memory playing out in Shaq's mind, his eyes focusing on something beyond the studio walls. Kobe saw me looking at them, and he walked over. First time in 2 years we'd been within 10 feet of each other, and he said, they wanted to wear your jersey. I told them you were the best teammate I ever had. Just like that. No big moment, no cameras, just the truth. The vulnerability in Shaq's voice was striking. Here was a man who had dominated basketball courts and commanded attention in every room he entered, reduced to near whispers by the memory of a simple gesture. That's when I realized how stupid we'd been, Shaq continued. His kids didn't care about our egos or our arguments. They just knew that we'd been great together, and that was enough for them. It should have been enough for us. Sarah leaned forward. Did things change after that? Slowly, Shaq nodded. Very slowly. We'd text each other occasionally, usually about basketball stuff. When I won the championship with Miami in '06, he was one of the first people to congratulate me. When he scored 81 points that same year, I called him, because that was incredible, and I wanted him to know I respected it. The progress seemed painful in how gradual it was, years of careful steps toward rebuilding something that had once come naturally. But it was never the same, Shaq admitted, his voice heavy with regret. We were friendly, but we weren't friends. We respected each other, but we weren't brothers. There was always this wall between us, built from all those years of hurt and pride and stupid mistakes. A notification sounded from someone's phone in the studio, a brief intrusion of the modern world into this deeply personal conversation. Shaq didn't seem to notice. When I retired in 2011, Kobe called me. We talked for maybe an hour about my career, about what I wanted to do next. It was the longest conversation we'd had since 2003. And you know what? It felt so natural, like no time had passed at all. What did you talk about? Everything and nothing, Shaq said, his voice growing softer. He asked about my kids. I asked about his. He told me about some business ventures he was working on. I told him about my plans for television. Normal stuff, friend stuff. And I remember hanging up thinking, why didn't we do this sooner? The question hung in the air, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. Over the next few years, we got better. When the Lakers retired both our jerseys, we stood together and it felt right. When he scored 60 points in his final game, I was there cheering louder than anyone. I was so proud of him. Sarah could see tears gathering in Shaq's eyes again. They were approaching the most difficult part of this conversation. His retirement speech, Shaq continued, his voice beginning to crack. He thanked me. He called me his big brother and said he couldn't have done it without me. I cried that night. I went home and I cried because I realized we'd wasted so many years being stubborn when we could have been supporting each other. The emotion was building again, but this time Shaq didn't try to hide it. After he retired, we started talking more. Not all the time, but regularly. About our kids, about business, about the game. He was getting into coaching Gigi's team, and he'd ask me for advice about working with young players. I loved that. I loved that he trusted me enough to ask. It sounds like you were finally getting back to something like your old relationship. We were, Shaq said, and now the tears were flowing freely. We were getting there. Not all the way back, maybe we never could have gotten all the way back, but we were making progress. Real progress. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve, no longer caring about maintaining his composure for the cameras. The last time we spoke was about 3 weeks before. He couldn't finish the sentence. It was just a quick call about some business thing, but at the end he said, "Love you, big fella." Just like that. "Love you, big fella," and I said, "Love you too, little brother." The silence that followed was profound. Sarah felt the weight of what Shaq was sharing, the incredible sadness of a relationship that was healing just as it was about to be torn away forever. "That's what kills me," Shaq whispered, his voice barely audible. "We were finally getting back to being brothers, and then I lost him forever." The studio felt different now, charged with the raw emotion of Shaq's revelations. Sarah could see the physical toll this conversation was taking on him. His usually perfect posture had given way to a slight slump, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water bottle beside his chair. This was grief in its purest form, unfiltered and devastating. January 26, 2020, Sarah said gently, knowing she didn't need to elaborate. Everyone knew what that date meant. Shaq's face crumpled at the mention of the date. For several seconds he couldn't speak at all, his massive frame shaking with silent sobs. When he finally found his voice, it was barely a whisper. "I was in bed when my phone started ringing. It was Charles Barkley. I almost didn't answer because Chuck calls me all the time with random stuff, but something made me pick up." He paused, wiping his nose with a tissue. Chuck's voice was different, shaky. He said, "Shaq, you need to turn on the news right now." The memory was clearly painful, but Shaq seemed determined to share it. "I turned on CNN and there it was. Helicopter crash in Calabasas. 9 people dead. And then they said the names." His voice broke completely. "Kobe Bryant. Gianna Bryant. I dropped the phone. I literally dropped the phone and fell to my knees." Sarah felt tears forming in her own eyes. The rawness of Shaq's grief was overwhelming, even 3 years after the tragedy. The first thing that went through my mind wasn't sadness, Shaq continued, his voice thick with emotion. It was panic, pure panic, because I realized that all the conversations we were never going to have, all the apologies I never made, all the times I should have called him but didn't, it was all gone. Forever. He looked directly at Sarah, his eyes red and swollen. You know what my second thought was? Gigi, that beautiful little girl who loved basketball as much as her father did. She was supposed to have a whole life ahead of her. She was supposed to grow up and maybe play in the WNBA, maybe coach, maybe do something completely different. But she was supposed to grow up. The mention of Gianna seemed to hit Shaq even harder than talking about Kobe. His grief wasn't just for his lost friend and teammate, but for a child whose potential would never be realized. I couldn't function for days, he admitted. I kept picking up my phone to call him, forgetting for just a second that he was gone. I'd see something funny online and think, Kobe would get a kick out of this, and then remember. The grief was like a physical weight on my chest. Sarah waited as Shaq composed himself, understanding that this was the moment he'd been building toward throughout their conversation. At the memorial service at Staples Center, Shaq continued, I sat there listening to all these beautiful speeches about what a great father he was, what a mentor he'd become, how he was finally at peace with his legacy. And all I could think about was the conversation we never had. What conversation? The one where I told him everything I'm telling you now, Shaq said, his voice gaining strength despite his tears. The one where I told him that our rivalry made us both better, that I was proud of him not just as a player, but as a man, that watching him become a father and seeing how much he loved those girls made me love him even more. He paused, struggling with the enormity of his regret. I wanted to tell him that our arguments were never really about basketball. They were about two people who cared so much about winning that we forgot to care about each other. I wanted to tell him that he was right about a lot of things I was too stubborn to admit at the time. The confession seemed to exhaust Shaq, and he slumped back in his chair. But mostly, he whispered, I wanted to tell him I was sorry. Sorry for all the petty arguments. Sorry for the times I chose my ego over our friendship. Sorry for waiting so long to really try to fix things between us. Sarah could feel the weight of his words settling over the studio. This wasn't just grief. It was the specific torture of unfinished business, of love unexpressed until it was too late. How do you live with that regret, Shaq? How do you move forward? Shaq was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, there was something different in his eyes. Still sad, but also resolved. I try to honor him, he said simply. I try to be the friend to other people that I should have been to him. When I have a problem with someone now, I don't let it fester. I don't wait for the perfect moment. I pick up the phone. He wiped his eyes one more time, then sat up straighter in his chair. I talk to young players differently now. When I see two teammates having issues, I don't just tell them to work it out. I tell them about Kobe and me. I tell them that pride is expensive, and sometimes you can't afford to pay the price. What would you want people to understand about your relationship with Kobe? Shaq thought for a moment, then looked directly into the camera. That it was real. The good parts and the bad parts were both real. We weren't perfect teammates, and we weren't perfect friends, but we were brothers, even when we didn't act like it. And brotherhood doesn't end just because you're not in the same place anymore. His voice grew, stronger as he continued. I want people to know that Kobe Bryant was one of the greatest competitors I ever met. But more than that, he was a good man who loved his family and wanted to make the world better. I want people to know that our story isn't a cautionary tale about ego or fame. It's a story about love that was complicated but real. And your biggest regret? My biggest regret, Shaq said, his voice steady now despite the tears, is that I waited until it was almost too late to tell him how much he meant to me. Don't make that mistake. If you love someone, if you respect someone, if someone has made your life better, tell them. Tell them today. Tell them now. Because tomorrow isn't promised to any of us. The studio fell silent, the weight of Shaq's words settling over everyone present. Outside, Los Angeles continued its eternal hum, unaware that one of its most famous sons had just bared his soul on camera. "Thank you, Shaq," Sarah said softly. "Thank you for sharing this with us." Shaq nodded, wiping his eyes one final time. "Thank you for letting me talk about him. He deserves to be remembered, and he deserves to have his story told right. All of it. The complicated parts and the beautiful parts." As the cameras stopped rolling, Shaq remained in his chair for several minutes, staring out at the lights of the city where he and Kobe had shared glory and heartbreak, triumph and regret. Somewhere out there, in the vast sprawl of Los Angeles, their story lived on. Not perfect, but real, and more powerful for its imperfections. The interview would air the following week, and millions would watch Shaquille O'Neal cry for his lost friend. But in that quiet studio, as the crew packed up their equipment, the tears had already done their most important work. They had honored a friendship that was complicated and beautiful and gone too soon, and they had reminded everyone watching that love, even imperfect love, is worth fighting for while we still have time.